Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues and friends. My name is Sainty. I am the British Ambassador to Portugal, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you all to the opening of this series of virtual workshops, in the course of which we intend to explore the question, is science advice for policy useful in modern societies? So this is the first of 3 workshops which we at the British Embassy in Lisbon are organising in close partnership with the Centre for the Philosophy of Sciences at the University of Lisbon. So the first thing I want to do is say a really big thank you to the Centre, and in particular to Dr. Almeida for the wonderful collaboration that we have had in planning and delivering this project. Thank you so much for that. But I also extend my warmest thanks to our moderator today, Elizabeth Suka, and to our fantastic speakers for agreeing to spare their precious time to take part in this conversation. So today's session is going to focus on the role of science in policy making. And I think you will all agree with me that this theme has considerable relevance today. The COVID-19 experience has surely demonstrated in so many ways just check. I think my microphone just turned off. I think it's on. I hope it is. I hope you can hear me. So I was just saying that the COVID-19 experience, I think, has demonstrated in many ways how science must be right at the very heart of shaping public policy as our governments and health authorities have responded to the pandemic. And I think that in itself would be enough for at least one very substantial discussion. But we want to be more ambitious and look at how science and scientific advice to governments is also vital in addressing other global challenges. And for me, the most obvious of those is climate change. This is a top priority for the UK government and for me and my team at the embassy here in Lisbon. This year, as many of you will know, the UK is taking over the presidency of the UN Conference of Parties on Climate Change. We're going to be co-hosting the COP26 Climate Change Summit in Glasgow in November, which I think we all agree is an extraordinarily important moment for our planet and for our future. And of course, science will be front and centre of all the arguments that will be deployed to bring about the changes in social and economic policy that are going to be needed to achieve our zero carbon emission targets around the world by the middle of the century and avert a climate catastrophe. But I also think at the same time it's important to recognise that science isn't necessarily the answer to everything, and scientists cannot be expected to solve all of our problems. It's part of a much broader spectrum of economic, social and political factors that inform the judgments and the decisions that governments and policymakers have to make. And so I think a really interesting part of this discussion is also about the limits of science in policy making, and I'm looking forward to some interesting reflections on that. Now, as I explained at the beginning, I'm the British Ambassador, so you're going to have to forgive me for saying a little bit about how the United Kingdom integrates science into its policy making. And over the years, the UK has developed a framework for science-based policy making, both in government and in Parliament. And this aims to guarantee that decision makers always have access to high quality and relevant research and evidence from both inside and outside the public administration. And in the UK, a number of posts and structures have been set up to support this, including notably the position of the Government Chief Scientific Advisor, a post currently held by Sir Patrick Vallance, who's become a very visible and public figure over the last 12 months. He's supported by a team of chief scientific advisors in each ministry. We also have the Government Office for Science, which aims at building scientific capability across government. And another example of a science advisory structure is what is known as SAGE, the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies, a committee that many people in the UK had probably not heard of a year ago, but which is now very famous because of its role in providing scientific advice to government relating to the COVID pandemic. But it's not, of course, just a question of posts and structures, and our experience has shown us that it's also really important to create a culture that promotes trust and understanding between the scientific community and policymakers, so that everyone is clear what advice is being sought, by whom and for what purpose. And experts and scientists need to be properly integrated into that process so that they can be clear about what role they are being asked to perform, where it starts and where it finishes. And another crucial part of effective science advice, in my view, is public communication. It's really important. And again, this is a massive lesson that we've learned during the pandemic, that the evidence on which decisions are based is clearly communicated, particularly, I think, on those occasions when policy decisions may appear to some people to be inconsistent with the science, the data and the evidence. Now, I'm not for one moment claiming that the UK system is perfect. Of course it isn't. But we are confident, I think, that a robust process of science advice does undoubtedly improve the quality of our decision-making processes. So we in the UK are really happy to share our experience. We're very interested in the experience of others, including Portugal, and we're really keen to explore whether there are ways in which we can collaborate with countries like Portugal on the science and policy-making agenda. And more widely, I wanted to use this opportunity to underline once again, and some of you will have heard me say this before, the importance that I attach to UK-Portugal bilateral collaboration on science and innovation. This is already a really strong relationship. We are Portugal's third biggest partner for collaborative projects, and 1 in every 5 Portuguese scientists who studies and researches overseas is actually based in the UK. But we can always do better. I would like to see more, even stronger science connections between these two countries. And my colleague Frederico Leira, who many of you will already know, is our Science and Innovation Officer at the British Embassy here, and he should be your first point of contact in the embassy for all things science related. Finally, as you all know, the UK and the European Union have recently signed a trade and cooperation agreement following the UK's exit from the EU. And the good news is that under the terms of that agreement, the UK has undertaken to participate or continue to participate, this time in an associate capacity with Euratom, Copernicus and Horizon Europe, provided, of course, the EU does ratify the trade agreement and subject to the terms and regulations that will define our participation in those programs. But the main point about all of this is that whether we're in or out of the EU, we are determined to maintain our friendly relationship and close scientific collaboration with Portugal and indeed with other European partners. And I hope that you will all agree with me that that is really good news. Now, I think that's definitely more than enough words from me. So without further delay, I will now hand over to Mara Almeida to provide a short introduction to these workshops. I warmly encourage all of you to participate in what we hope will be a lively session. Hope you all enjoy it. I hope also very much to see many of you again on the 18th and 25th of March for the second and third workshops of this series. Thank you very much.
Thank you all. Good afternoon. Welcome everybody to the workshop, also on my behalf, and many thanks for joining us from different parts of Portugal and much beyond. I'm Mara Almeida. I'm a researcher at the Center for Philosophy of Science of the University of Lisbon. And I have been working at the interface of science and policy for a few years now, so it's a great pleasure for me to offer a few introductory remarks. First of all, I would like very much to thank all the speakers and the moderator for having accepted the invitation to participate in the first session of this three-part conference, as well as to all the participants present today. It's really great to see so much interest in today's session, as well as in the following ones. As clearly as we've seen with COVID-19 pandemic, but before that, many other global challenges, such as climate change, have highlighted many of the difficulties on the role and relevance of science advice for policy. And this is a side of the inherent uncertainties which are associated with available knowledge and information. So building on the work that myself and others have been doing in science policy in Portugal over the last years, following a very successful event in 2019, and thanks to the interest of the British Embassy Lisbon, we thought that it's both relevant and timely to continue the debate on understanding and fostering the relation of science and policy, so as to support the best political decision-making processes. More specifically, we aim to discuss the nature of science and the appropriate extent of its contributions both to policies and societal developments. So as far as the first session is concerned, and in a simple way, we could say that science aims to contribute to a better understanding of the natural world through a combination of processes having as basis the scientific method. But to be able to understand the relationship between science and policy, we need to have a close look at science itself, at what it entails and what it can offer now and in the future in its relations to policy and politics. However, importantly, we also need to understand how science is perceived, its limitations and challenges. The second and the third session focus instead on how to deliver science advice to government and to parliament. There are a range of models and structures through which science advice takes place in different countries, typically with respect to either the executive power, the government, or the legislative power, the parliament. And the nature of science advice provided to them differs, being tailored to their distinctive functions, and that's what we will be discussing on the next two sessions. As a final note for today, I'll just like to remark that the world is facing increasingly complex challenges which will need good qualitative scientific evidence to support the development of robust policies and build the future we imagine for us and also for the next generations. This, I think, will require all of us to foster a constructive dialogue between different actors in our society, but also to engage with each other inclusively, respectfully, and effectively. So once again, thank you for participating, and I'll now give the floor to Elizabeth, our moderator. Thank you once again.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session. My name is Elizabeth Suka. I'm Managing Editor and Global Healthcare Editorial Lead at the Economist Intelligence Unit. And we have a great panel today, and what a great topic. You know, we're going to learn more about the exact role of science advice, its place in society, and hopefully some best practices going forward as well. I mean, from my perspective, you know, over the last 12 months, and today is a very important day, it's 1 year after the World Health Organization declared a COVID pandemic. We've seen a rapid boost to public knowledge around scientific processes. People talk about RNA vaccines, R0 values. We've seen scientists placed in unusually prominent positions in our societies, you know, with Anthony Fauci, Patrick Vallance, and Chris Whitty becoming, you know, household names. But we've also seen intense public and political and media scrutiny and confusion and misinformation. And, you know, some governments have failed to bring different strands of advice together to form a coherent strategy. We've also heard this mantra, following the science, from politicians. But were they right to say that? What are the limits of science, as Mara kind of says earlier? And scientists were consulted for some policies, and scientists were consulted for some, but not for others. I mean, I can think of the UK's Eat Out to Help Out scheme. Some were consulted too late, and some have been sidelined. We've seen that in the US. So is scientific advice only one input out of many in the decision-making process? and ultimately, is it just up to politicians and policymakers to make judgments for us, for our societies and economies? So we have a lot to discuss today. So we've got a great panel today, and I'm going to introduce them briefly now. And they're going to talk for 15 minutes each, and I'm going to talk to them very quickly after that, just a short Q&A, before we open our whole panel discussion at the end for about 40 minutes. So our speakers today are Heather Douglas, Associate Professor at the Philosophy Department in Michigan State University. We also welcome James Wilsden, who is the Professor of Research Policy at the University of Sheffield, and Clarissa Rios, Research Associate at the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk at the University of Cambridge. And their full biographies are on the website, so please do read that. Unfortunately, Maria Carvalho, who's the MEP, was unable to join us today for personal reasons. And also, if you're using social media today, we are using the hashtag #SciencePolicy. So I do welcome now Heather to come and speak to us for 15 minutes. Thank you, Heather.
Thank you for that brief introduction and overview of what we're doing. I hope that everyone can hear me and that I'm live now. And I want to thank everyone for inviting me to kick off this excellent forum. I want to start a discussion today with what science for policy is not. Let's go to the next slide. Can we advance to the next slide? There we go. There are clear things that it cannot be. It cannot be a straightforward transfer of true fixed facts from science to policy, or from the realm of science to the realm of politics, because science is not in the business of fixed truths. Fixed truths are dogmas. And because, and the one constant in science is that in principle, every empirical claim is open to challenge. It is the ability of new evidence, improved models, and better theory to challenge previously accepted scientific beliefs that should give us confidence in the reliability of science. Science produces the most reliable empirical knowledge we can have at any given time. It does not produce permanent facts or truths. Science for policy is also not just the assertions of one group of authorities or interest group to another group of authorities. It is not just yet another form of power in politics. Science has had and continues to have, despite public skepticism and contestation of some areas of expertise, broad cultural authority. This broad cultural authority is not an unfounded reliance on science based on the public's gullibility. There are very good reasons why science has been granted such cultural authority, from past spectacular successes to the culture of criticism and empirical investigation that undergirds most scientific efforts. Finally, science for policy is not the transfer of something value-free to the realm of value disputes. Science is not value-free. Value judgments properly saturate scientific practice. Scientists must decide what is important to study and what is not, setting the research agenda. Further, scientists have to decide which methods are adequate for their purposes, which modeling assumptions to employ, and which categories to use in parsing empirical phenomena. All of these decisions require some value judgments. Finally, scientists must decide when investigations have produced enough evidence that some conclusions can be drawn. This moment of inference, of assessment of evidential sufficiency, also requires value judgments. Philosophers of science have spent the past few decades dissecting these moments of choice and showing that values have a crucial, although not determinative, role to play in all parts of scientific practice. Science can neither pursue nor conclude research without values. Next slide, please. Yet the idea of science for policy as speaking value-free truth to value-laden power has had a potent grip on our understanding of science advising. Indeed, the ideal of the independent science advisor, where the science advisor acts from a place outside of societal values and politics, independent of political power of their advisees, dates back at least to Walter Lippmann's 1922 Public Opinion and has predominated our views since the Cold War. One can find a full articulation of this vision in Don K. Price's 1965 classic, The Scientific Estate, where he describes a spectrum from truth to power, with science at the truth end, mediated in application by professionals and administrators, and moving to the politicians at the power end. the scientist being solely concerned with the pursuit of truth is free of values, politics, and responsibility. In contrast to the realm of advisees such as politicians, where we have value-ladenness and they're interested in power. Only a science advisor independent of the pull of power, way over on the other end of the spectrum, can speak truth to power properly with this ideal. But I've just given you good reasons to think this ideal will not do. Science is not value-free, not just about truth, and also not just about power. Science advising is too important not to be structured by norms and ideals, so we need a better ideal. Next slide. I want to argue that a better ideal for science advice, for science for policy, is to be found not in independence, but in constraint. Science advisors have ongoing obligations, lines of both responsibilities and accountability, to three crucial groups. 1, to the scientific community, 2, to their advisees, those they advise, and 3, to the broader general public. There should be no rank ordering or hierarchy among these lines of obligation, or indeed general trade-offs among them. Instead, the science advisor must always have all 3 lines of obligation in mind. All 3 constrain and shape what the advisor should say. This is a central reason why the job of the science advisor is so difficult. And I have never talked to a science advisor who thought that their job was easy. However, honoring these 3 lines of constraint is also a crucial basis for trust in the science advisor. Finally, having these 3 lines locates the science advisor in a position that is not fully independent, as the old ideal conceived of the job, but provides resources for resisting the pull of raw political power. So let's go to the next slide. Let's start with the obligations to the scientific community. Even in the old ideal, the science advisor was not fully independent. The science advisor was always construed as of, from, and dependent on the scientific community in which they honed their expertise, in which they developed their expertise, and which grounded their reliability. Science advisors need to retain their connections to the expert communities from which they come and on which their advice is based. Most do, and doing so helps them retain their expertise and reliability while allowing them to draw on other experts for input when needed. Such expert communities also can provide potent criticisms of science advisors when they think the advisor is reporting science inaccurately. A science advisor who provides advice rejected as inaccurate or insufficiently up to date with the scientific work should be publicly criticized as inadequate by the scientific community. Debate in the scientific community about pieces of scientific advice reveals the strength of the empirical basis for the advice, important value judgments shaping the advice, because those are often part of the contestation, and the limits of existing expertise on the topics on which advice is sought. Most science advisors, even in the old independence model, maintained this connection to and dependency on the scientific community. This is a line of responsibility and accountability crucial to good science advice. So that's the first line. Next slide. The second line of obligation is, of course, to the advisee, to those to whom the advisor offers their advice. This can be a single person, such as a prime minister, president, or agency head, or minister, a well-defined group of people, such as a parliament, a congress, or an agency, or a more diffuse, undefined group, such as government more broadly. All advisees need science advice to make better decisions, and usually as well to help them justify their decisions publicly, although that, depending on the nature of the advising position, there can be confidentiality requirements. What is crucial is that advisors ensure their advice is relevant to the concerns of the advisee and that it takes into account, even if it ultimately challenges, the values of the advisee. If the science advisor is maintaining their responsibilities to the scientific community for scientific accuracy, the advice will not collapse into political pandering. Advisors should also honor obligations of clarity to the advisee. The advisor must make their advice clear in order to be useful. The advisor should not be attempting to make their advisee an expert, So complete detail is not helpful. Too much detail can actually hide the message. So we're not trying as advisors to impart the fullness of all of the expert considerations. The advisors, the obligations of clarity include clarity about the value judgments crucial to the shaping of the advice and the limits of the available expertise, so that the advisee understands how best to take on board the advice. And finally, advisors should not edit the advice to get the advisee to act in a particular way. So it shouldn't be so simplified in order to get the advisee to just move to a particular conclusion that the advisor prefers. If there are crucial uncertainties, they must be made clear. Okay, third slide. Next slide. The third line of obligation is to the broader democratic public. Science advisors can be abused by politicians to serve their narrow political purposes, to bolster politically preferred views without merit, or to attempt to use the authority of science to back a project that the science advisors do not actually think is a good idea. The public needs to be able to evaluate their politicians with respect to their receipt and utilization of science advice. And sometimes they also need to access to scientific advice because they will act directly on that advice. I think the COVID-19 pandemic has made that really importantly clear. For these reasons, the default should be that science advice should be made public. So that should be generally presumed. There can be exceptions, but they should be rare. And if one-on-one advice is inaccurately used to claim scientific support by an advisee, the advisor should go public with their actual advice. Otherwise, they're not meeting their obligations to the public to make clear what the advice was. They owe the public no less. Just as with advisors' obligations to their advisees, science advisors should make clear the basis for their advice, including the key empirical information, the values shaping it, and the limits to it. So now you all might think that this is way too demanding, but I think recent history gives us a great example of a science advisor who met his obligations along all three lines and maintained the public trust in a very difficult time as a result. Next slide. So the advisor I'm thinking of is Dr. Anthony Fauci, who throughout 2020, throughout one of the most divisive political years in American history, in the midst of a really difficult pandemic, maintained the overwhelming majority of trust in the American public. So he had over 60% trust approval ratings, which is astonishing for America in 2020, and became the most trusted advisor on COVID-19. So we might ask why. How did Dr. Fauci continue to maintain this kind of trust? And I think it was because he maintained all three lines of obligation ongoing in his function as a science advisor. He maintained his obligations to the scientific community, continually, updating his advice, paying attention to new evidence, being in continual conversation with epidemiologists and other crucial medical experts, and also acknowledged their limits to his expertise on a continual basis. So if you've ever heard Dr. Fauci speak about COVID-19 at any point in time in the pandemic, he also was very clear about what was remaining unknown. He also was very clear with his obligations to his advisees. He offered very clear pieces of communication and was very clear with his own value commitments that shaped that communication, what concerned him the most. Very often that was saving lives, which is something that the vast majority of the people that trusted him could get on board with. And the same was true with his communications, with his obligation to the public. He had very clear communication strategies and also was very clear with his value commitments. So I think we cannot underestimate the importance of being clear about one's values as a science advisor, because a crucial part of the basis of trust in a science advisor is going to be the existence of those shared values. When values are shared, they ground trust in expert advice. And when values are not shared, they actually properly drive distrust. If a science advisor expresses values that you wholly disagree with, that is not a good science advisor to place your trust in. So this is a really important aspect of science advice. We can also see the 2020 election as in many ways a referendum on politicians' response to scientific advice. So was really useful for the public to see the advice that politicians were getting and to see how they responded to that advice. Okay, last slide. We're almost done. Science advisors functioning to provide science for policy have three key lines of obligation, I have argued. They have obligations to the scientific community, to their advisees, and to the broader public. None of these lines can be generally prioritized over the other. The science advisor must function in constant awareness of and act in ways that meet their obligations to all three lines. This clarifies why the job of the science advisor is so challenging. But doing it right is worth it. Meeting the obligations of these three lines provides grounds for trust in science advisors. The line of responsibility and accountability to the scientific community ensures that science advisors do not get captured by their advisees and any desires for science advice to produce a particular outcome. The line to the advisees ensures that the science advice is targeted to the issues of deep concern to the advisees and is part of the political accountability for the value judgments necessary for science advice, because we vote politicians in and out of office very often on the basis of their value judgments. This line of obligation is central to the usefulness of advice. The line to the public enables another line of accountability for the value judgments of science advisors, enables the public to evaluate their elected and appointed officials' responses to science advice. Seeing that a science advisor shares crucial values with the broader public and is responsive to the information and criticism from the scientific community is crucial to the public trust in science advisors and is a key aspect of the democratic process. In short, it is the constraints placed on advice by all three lines of obligation that make science advice trustworthy and useful. Indeed, without trust in the advice, it would not be useful because no one would listen to it. Trustworthiness does not arise from independence, but rather from constraint. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Heather, for that. Really, really interesting. I really like this concept of having three lines of kind of three masters, so to speak. But in practice, I mean, Fauci is obviously a very, very ideal sort of person, and he seems to have done it well. And but it's not been easy for all scientists. And I'd like to explore this concept a little bit more about, as a scientist, as an individual, and then as a scientist, when you're part of a committee. So, you know, a committee makes a decision. And so, for example, in the UK, we have SAGE. And then, but you, in your own individual capacity, you'll say something to the public. And that can cause kind of confusion sometimes, or a mixed public health messaging. So I think it's a lovely ideal scenario, but I'd just love you to comment more about really in practice what's happening around the world on this.
Sure. So, you know, some science advisors function with, you know, as individual science advisors, and very often they have sort of committees behind them, but they sort of funnel the information forward. And many science advisors operate within committees. One of the crucial things about committee-based science advice that I think should structure things is that committees should be clear when there is disagreement among the committee. I mean, very often when committees are working over the practice of crafting the advice over months, very often, sometimes they come to consensus, right? But sometimes they don't. Sometimes there are remaining minority opinions. And I think the ultimately produced science advice needs to make clear that that actually happened, so that a member of the committee who might, you know, disagree in some ways with some of the conclusions can say, you know, yes, the report said X, but I actually think the right way to take, you know, the evidence we have existing, and given the concerns that I have, I think we should be more focused on Y. And you should be able to see both of those things in the report. Science is a complicated, messy process, and I think hiding that from the public breeds more distrust as opposed to grounding or like providing a basis for trust, because the messiness usually comes out and then the public feels like you're hiding something.
Yes, we don't want the public to think that. We've got a question from the audience, which is kind of related to my question, but it's taking it a little bit broader. It says, how would the 3 lines of obligation be affected if one moves to an international setting, such as an international organization, requesting or receiving science advice? I mean, obviously, you've got your national setting and then that bigger, broader setting. If you could comment on that.
Wow, that is a hard question. Okay. I still think, so I think that at this point in time, a broad international advice very often has that kind of general, you're not advising a particular body. Usually it's, governments across the world and the public across the world. And so that sort of ends up in that very sort of general category. And then it's beholden on the science advisor in that case to really be paying attention to the value judgments that shape the scoping of the project, that shape what they think is in the frame and outside of the frame of the project. That has to really be clear. And then they have to be really clear about the value judgments that are shaping their assessments of what counts as sufficiently confirmed to be considered like actionable advice. Because there are so many different parties that could potentially depend on that advice, those parties have to be clued into what's really structuring the advice, right? And so then it becomes beholden on the advisor to be as clear as possible with those sorts of structuring judgments.
Thank you for that. And because you're based in the US and our audience today is from all over the world, I'd love to just kind of unpack a little bit of what happened in the US, especially under the Trump administration. So in your opinion, did science create a polarization, or is it a victim of a polarizing environment? I mean, could you talk to us more about what happened in the US in your opinion and what we can learn going forward now with the new administration?
So science, sometimes science can aid polarization, particularly when scientists discover something that changes the boundaries between the public and the private, challenges traditional views of what is public and private, and says, no, actually, the thing that you thought might have been like a private issue is actually a public issue, or vice versa. So science can be inherently political in that sense. But I think that in the US in 2020 and in recent years, the political culture has become so polarizing. It doesn't matter what you throw in to the public space or the public discussion, it gets polarized. And I think that is far more about the existing political structures in the US, things like senators being on live stream all the time, and so they're speaking more to their constituents than to each other, sort of problems of campaign finance, sort of like underlying democratic institutions that are driving polarized politics far more than anything specific to science. But again, this is probably outside my area of expertise. Truth is.
No, but thank you for trying to answer that. It's a very hard question. And we got another good question from the audience. And Mara and myself at the beginning, we talked about the limits of science. It's a very good question. And the question is, science constitutes to better understanding of the natural world, but what about policy? It's asking really, what are the limits of policy? Is that something you could try and tackle and answer?
Right. So it depends on the political system that you have. In the US, Congress makes laws and then agencies make policy. And very often when we talk about policy, we kind of blur together the legislative and the administrative aspects of these things, but they operate under very sort of different legal structures. If you're going, Congress makes laws, and whatever laws Congress makes, as long as they're not unconstitutional, which is something battled out in the courts, it's the law. And then the administration makes policy, but it has to be under the Administrative Procedures Act. It has to follow the Federal Advisory Committee Act, which means all advisory committees, their advice has to be made public unless there's some like national security confidentiality issues involved. There's and they have to be mandated by the congressional laws to make the policy. They have to have sort of the legal ability to make the policy. So there's procedural stuff, there's legal mandates, and then still they can be challenged in court. So there's all these kind of constraints that are built into how the agencies work. Different countries have very different systems. So I know the UK operates, it's not a divided powers system. It's a, parliamentary system. And so you have much more coordination and similar control. The Prime Minister is head of both the legislative body and the administrative body. So that ends up being a very different kind of system. And I would let someone from the UK speak to that before I would. So, the limits of policy depend upon the political system that you live under.
Well said. I think you're totally right there. We've got lots of questions coming through. Keep them coming through, but we will now move on to our next speaker. I have great pleasure in introducing James Wilsden, Professor of Research Policy at the University of Sheffield and Director of the Research on Research Institute. Welcome, James, and you're on for the next 15 minutes. I'll see you in a bit.
Great, thank you, Elizabeth, very much. Sorry to be a bit last minute arriving at the event. I was stuck in a Microsoft Teams limbo for a bit there, but I did catch Heather's excellent talk, and I think it's a fantastic introduction to the field, and I wholly endorse the sort of shift that Heather's very eloquently outlined in the way that we think about models of scientific advice and the different constituencies to which advisors have responsibilities and obligations. I think that's a very useful way of framing the debate, and it's of course something that we've seen very acutely, as you've already been discussing just now in the questions, in the context of the past 12 months and the pandemic. And I thought I would take that as my sort of cue in a way to build on Heather's points and offer a few observations about ways in which scientific advice has operated, been effective, been less effective under this intense and really unique set of pressures that have confronted advisors, policymakers, and broader advisory systems. So if my slides are there, can you see my slides yet? I think you're putting them up at your end. But while they arrive, as it were, I was going to talk drawing from a rather nice little book that came out just before Christmas about the pandemic. Of course, the pandemic, as well as changing so much of life around us over the last year, has already now triggered a sort of small industry of books, and of course we've had, I think at last count, something like 250,000 academic articles published on or around COVID-19 in the past 12 months. So a huge amount has been and continues to be said on this topic. But one rather nice book that I read and enjoyed just before Christmas, I read it over the Christmas holidays, was this one. Is It Tomorrow Yet? Paradoxes of the Pandemic. And this is a little book that was written by Ivan Krastev, who's a Bulgarian political scientist, and he normally works, or most of his work has been on dynamics of integration and nationalism in, across Europe, particularly Central Eastern Europe, the forces that bring Europe together or potentially fracture Europe. Of course, that's a hot topic for us in Britain these days. But he turned his attention in this book to the pandemic, and he talked and identified in this book 7 sort of paradoxes that he observed. So if we just move on to the next slide, I won't list all of those because of time. I won't even go through them in any detail, but just very briefly, what does he see as broad paradox? I mean, he's coming at this, obviously, as I say, as a political scientist. Firstly, that COVID exposes the dark side of globalization, but also acts as an agent of globalization. So we see both things going on at once. Secondly, that it's accelerated the trend towards deglobalization that we saw to some extent and was certainly speculated about very widely in the aftermath of the financial crisis 10, 11 years ago, 12 years ago now, while at the same time exposing the limits of renationalization. A third paradox, that fear of the virus in the early stages inspired a state of national unity that many societies haven't experienced for a very long time, but in the long term, according to Krastev at least, it will deepen existing social political divides. And I think we're already seeing aspects of that in a whole range of different national settings. Fourth COVID's put democracy on hold, at least in Europe, but by doing so, it has also illustrated the limits of people's appetite and desire for more authoritarian government. Again, something that I'm sure we all could resonate with and could see happening around us. And finally, this is where it sort of dovetails on our debate here, that it initially restored trust in expertise and science, while at the same time it's produced some of the most shocking conspiracy theories. I mean, yes, that is somewhat paradoxical. I think it's actually not as interesting a paradox as some of his others. And so I sort of thought I'd take my cue really from that and try and think of sort of dig a bit deeper, as it were, into the past 12 months and identify a few science advice or science policy paradoxes that we see and have seen taking place around us. So moving on to the next slide. I won't read these out now because I'll go through them in the next slide. But anyway, taking inspiration, as I say, from the notion that this has been a very paradoxical and is a very paradoxical period. There's lots of things going on simultaneously in different directions, and I think that makes it very tempting to analyze the pandemic and what it means in a way that's very sort of inflected by our sort of prior assumptions and preferences and biases, the so-called coronavirus confirmation syndrome. But it's important to step back and acknowledge the contradictions and tensions that are at play, and that's definitely been the case when we start to think about scientific advice. So next slide. What might the paradoxes be that we observe? And I mean, we've already heard bits of this from Heather and from the introductory remarks. In the past year, scientific advice has never been in more demand, nor has it been more contested. This isn't a new observation. There's a very nice book there now, which is at least a decade old, by Wiebe Bijker and colleagues, which talks about the paradox of scientific authority and talks about exactly this phenomenon in a more in a much less intensely politicized context of advisory processes in Dutch health policy. But in the pandemic, absolutely, this has been the case. And I mean, Heather and I are sort of unusual because we're part of quite a small group of people who've been thinking and poking around at science advice systems for a long time. But suddenly, obviously, these roles and structures, whether they're individual based, committee based, whatever it might be, have been thrust, as we've been hearing, into the glare of public media political scrutiny like never before. And it's really been quite unprecedented. I mean, I for several years used to teach a master's course in science policy. I teach about science advice, and one would always, as a lecturer, struggle often to find good visual representations of an advisory role. I had one nice picture of John Holdren, the former White House advisor, walking down a corridor in the White House with Barack Obama. Several of the UK chief scientists, you've never, literally no public photos existed of them with their respective prime minister. Now, of course, we've gone through in Britain a year in which almost nightly we've had these press conferences, and you see one there on the slide, the Prime Minister flanked by Patrick Vallance, who the ambassador mentioned, our chief scientific advisor, and Chris Whitty, the chief medical officer, and then an additional larger cast of advisors on the SAGE committee in Public Health England and elsewhere. So it's a fascinating thing to watch at multiple levels, and also to scrutinise and engage with critically. These figures have become, especially as the thing has dragged on and on, and as Heather was saying, in the context of Anthony Fauci, they've become celebrities in their own right, in a way. You see there, you can buy mugs and T-shirts now with Chris Whitty's face on, which is very bizarre in a way. But underneath that sort of more frothy part of this, there's obviously some very deep debate and contestation going on. Lots of different views as to whether the advisory systems are overly precautionary, whether they're insufficiently attendant to balancing health, economic and wider interests, whether they're sufficiently transparent. This was a very big issue in the UK and has been elsewhere, particularly in the early part of the pandemic. And basically, whether they are tapping into the right mix of expertise. And these are not new questions, but they have been asked with unprecedented force and frequency over this period. So That's my first paragraph. Moving on to the second slide. So this is another interesting observation that pertains particularly to countries like the UK and I think the US, in that, well, they're not the only two that would fall into this category, but they're perhaps the two most visible. Countries that were among the best informed, by which I mean had the most sophisticated and developed advisory systems already in place, and I mean, you know, over many decades in the case of both US and UK, and indeed had specific strategies of various kinds for dealing with pandemics. You know, even though aspects of that had been left to wither, at least by the Trump administration, but you know, there were strategies in place. They were placed, you know, I think 1 and 2 in the index of pandemic preparedness only a year or so before COVID-19 broke out. So they were best informed, and they were also, you know, they are also countries that invest very significant volumes of R&D money in biomedical and health research. So they've got very sophisticated, complex, large biomedical research systems. And we're, you know, faced, I think, at this point, you know, 12 months in or whatever, with you know, this second paradox, that these countries that, you know, on any reading should have done, should have managed this awful trial with relative effectiveness, have actually performed very badly, at least in terms of you know, case numbers, hospitalizations, deaths, etc. And I think this really does merit more reflection and discussion, and you know, I think the sort of stock take of all of this will have to, you know, run over a number of years. It's not something one can come to a hasty conclusion on, because there's lots going on. But I'll just mention a very nice little piece on this that Dan Sarevitz, who's, you know, one of the wisest voices on, along with Heather, in US science policy, editorial in the latest issue of Issues in Science and Technology, writing about the vaccine, you know, the incredible success with the vaccines, and saying, of course, that this is a magnificent achievement, but far from being a vindication of our current approach to science and innovation policy. It's both a conspicuous and happy exception, and a broad repudiation, because it forces us to reflect deeply on how and why a nation that, and this is obviously the US, that's now spending about $200 billion a year on biomed R&D and nearly $4 trillion on healthcare, was so ill prepared to cope with something that was widely understood to be inevitable, and what that means for how we ought to be pursuing knowledge and innovation for the public good in the future. And I think it also raises these very important questions about the connection between the, if you like, the science base, you know, the underpinning strengths of the research system, and the mechanisms that we then have for bringing relevant knowledge, expertise, evidence from that system into the orbit of public policy. So yeah, it's paradoxical. I've written about this with a colleague, Richard Jones, in the context of the UK as well. I mean, this was a couple of years ago. We did this big report called the Biomedical Bubble, which caused a bit of a few ruffled feathers in the biomedical research community. But it, you know, these questions need to be asked afresh and I'm sure recalibrated, and you know, they're quite complicated, the answers that we'll come to, but it definitely is paradoxical. Moving on to my third paradox. Yeah, so in almost any country we see this happening. Uncertainty and chaos continue to proliferate in response to the pandemic, alongside demands for consensus and control. The sort of precise site of that uncertainty and chaos has shifted over the course of the year. So we began in a situation that was beautifully encapsulated, I thought, by this article by Lorraine Daston, historian of science. She talked about this as ground zero empiricism. When the virus first emerged, we just knew so little really about how it operated, how it spread, that we were, you know, flailing around scientifically and of course politically. And then as it's gone on, there's of course been lots of debate within the scientific community, and then between the scientific community and wider society about what we do know, what we don't know, what level of certainty can be applied, how effective models are, all of these sorts of questions that we've seen at the forefront of debates, and which aren't unique to pandemics. I mean, one sees lots of these questions also relating to climate change, for example, but they've clearly, in this context, come to the fore with particular, you know, force and vigor. Within the scientific community itself, I mean, as Heather's already said, I mean, the scientific community should not pretend or act as if it speaks with one voice. That is never the case. In Britain, politically, in the early part of the pandemic, there was lots of talk of being led by the science, singular, bit following the science, singular, which I think was very unhelpful. And I think now there's a recognition that that was actually quite unhelpful, both on the part of the scientists and on the part of the politicians. But that, debate within the scientific community, of course, continues. And we've also had these high-profile sort of skirmishes on the formal institutional boundaries of science advice that have been very interesting to observe. So things like the Great Barrington Declaration, which emerged primarily from the US, but with UK scientists like Sunetra Gupta also involved, acting as a sort of rallying point for one particular set of perspectives on how we should respond to the pandemic. And then in a UK context, we have the ambassador mentioned the SAGE committee, the Scientific Advisory Group on Emergencies. We saw in May of last year, so sort of 2-3 months in, the emergence of this thing called IndySage, which was quite an unexpected development, led by none other than a former UK government chief scientific advisor, so Sir Patrick Vallance's predecessor, but 3, Sir David King, sort of coming out of quasi-retirement at the age of 80 and setting up a sort of shadow, almost a guerrilla science advice operation that was sort of, performing raids around the skirmishes of the official system. So this is very, very interesting to observe. I'll just flag a couple of projects. I haven't got much time to talk about this, but I have this role and I'm involved in this thing called INGSA, the International Network for Government Science Advice, which tries to bring together science advisors, scientists who just find themselves involved in advice, customers of advice in governments, etc., to reflect on these things. It's a big international network, and INGSA, like everyone else, has been doing work to try and make sense of all of this. There's a few interesting resources and papers on the INGSA website, including this one here. But I also particularly wanted to flag this last rather fuzzy image on the right of my slide. This report on comparative COVID response. This is the first product of a really interesting consortium project being led by Sheila Jasanoff at Harvard and Steve Hilgartner at Cornell, funded by the US National Science Foundation, and with a whole team of people from different countries involved, including me and a couple of colleagues from the UK, trying to look with a sort of science studies, sociology, politics of expertise lens at what's been going on. And if we just move to the next slide. There's some fantastic stuff in that report. It just came out at the end of January, and they sort of list a set of fallacies that were apparent, which again I won't go into because of time, but they also kind of cluster countries into these 3 broad categories of control models, consensus models, and chaos models, and they put the US into the chaos model. I think up until the point of the vaccine being rolled out, we probably put the UK in the chaos model as well, but anyway, that's perhaps a point for debate. But very, very interesting, because of course, so you're seeing sort of uncertainty operating at the micro level, as it were, in the detail of the actual empirical data emerging around the pandemic, but also as you move up to comparisons across entire national systems, you've also got similar dynamics at play. Moving on to the next slide, and I'm nearly done. A fourth paradox. The pandemic, in all sorts of ways, has made very visible the most attractive, exciting, dynamic, fantastic qualities of research cultures, and speed at which vaccines were developed. Lots of the fantastic work that's been done by epidemiologists, public health scientists from all sorts of areas who've many thousands of whom have given just made enormous contributions to all sorts of aspects of health and national response. But it's also, I think, exposed some of our dirtiest secrets, and by this I mean all of the dimensions of problems that we see in the actual production of some scientific studies, the speed at which some stuff is pushed out, the issues that we see with respect to equality, diversity, inclusion in the science community. And there's lots of things that have, things that were there as well in the science community, were always there, but which have again come to the fore, both good and bad. And there's a very nice piece, if you've not seen it, that Ed Yong, who's a fantastic science writer, wrote in The Atlantic just at the beginning of the year, this long article, How Science Beat the Virus and What It Lost in the Process, which is a great meditation really on this duality of both, the enormous, fantastic contribution and also things that we should worry about. And to summarize the quote there, that the scientific community in essence spent the pre-pandemic years developing faster ways of doing experiments, sharing data, etc., and then COVID emerged. It was able to deploy a lot of this, but the goal now, the priority now, as Ed Yong argues, and I would agree with this, is to also then address many of the lingering weaknesses that have been exposed, warped incentives, wasteful practices, overconfidence, which I think we've seen in lots of contexts. Again, I'd sort of point a finger at something like the Great Barrington Declaration, inequality, a biomedical bias, absolutely. COVID has exposed them all. So, there's big questions for us as a community coming out, and these also pertain to scientific advice. So my last slide, and then I'll shut up. So this is a broader point, but it does also apply to advisory systems. In a unique, remarkable, horrifying, and also, exciting in other respects in terms of its potential year like this. There's been all sorts of expectations, aspirations projected onto what will happen after the pandemic, the whole sort of build back better kind of narrative. And of course, as I said earlier, you've got in that context lots of people in essentially bringing to the situation things that they have wanted to be the case for quite some time and are now seeing a moment of opportunity, and that's quite natural, understandable, very human reaction to this sort of situation. There's a lovely piece that my former Sussex University colleague Andy Sterling wrote about this again near the beginning of the pandemic, and he talks about the dynamic by which people approach the pandemic with all these expectations, but when you actually pull back to what people are arguing, they're essentially arguing for what for most of them is business as usual. It may be transformative, but it's still a mode of transformation that was always that they were advocating already. And Sterling certainly argues, and I'd agree, that really the only thing one can say at this point is that we come out of the pandemic confronted by multiple uncertain paths. We don't really know what's going to happen. Of course, we don't really know what's going to happen at any time, but the degree of openness is heightened by this context, and of course the degree of risk and peril that attaches to it as well in terms of economic and other consequences. So for all the hype and hope of transformation, in many respects little at the moment has changed. And I think my final slide, to just end on this point, I think this really applies also to science advice models. I mean, Heather has given you her very nice three-part model of the lines of obligation. I mean, I'll give a sort of different version, but it's really making similar points that we're moving from, or we have seen, and this is over a number of years, movements from this old model of expert advice where it was closed, where it was homogenous, where it was hubristic in its claims to authority, where it demanded trust from the public, where it expected consensus, and where it exercised managerial control, to newer models which are more open, diverse, humble, which don't demand trust but instead trust, which expect advice to be plural and conditional, and which distribute control around the system. So that's where we want to be. We're not there yet. We've seen bits of both in the pandemic, and I guess the big question for science advice systems is where we go from here. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Those are just a few resources at the end, if you want more of this stuff.
Fantastic. I just wanted to unpack a bit the scientific advice process in the UK, SAGE, and your views on it, because you're in the UK, so you'd know a lot about it. I mean, SAGE has taken quite a prolonged kind of role in this current crisis. And when in other crises, be it in other areas, the issue gets handed back to a relevant public health body or another established body. Now, so is that the right approach you've taken of SAGE? Also, a little bit if you could talk about the transparency around SAGE and the sort of people that are on SAGE. I mean, there was talk there should be economists on SAGE. I do understand that with governments, they need advice from all sorts of people, and science is only one input. But can you talk us a little bit about what you think is what has been the effectiveness of SAGE, if at all? I'm sure it has.
Yes, I mean, a few things one can say about SAGE. I suppose first one should note that SAGE is quite a young structure. It was only set up a decade ago by when Sir John Beddington was chief scientist, to deal, obviously, as the name suggests, with scientific advice in emergencies. And it's been deployed at various points in the past decade to address crises, emergencies of various kinds. Typically, those are short run, things that run maybe for 2 weeks, maybe worse for a couple of months, but they're not, there's never been anything like this. So I think, the model was developed to cope with emergencies, but I don't think at the point of its creation and design, its architects had ever fully had any of us, fully contemplated a situation of this scale, complexity, duration, where there'd be so much at stake and so many demands on the system from different directions. So I think, we coming out of, if we are even coming out of it, but as we tiptoe at least towards the end of it, I think there are quite important questions about those structures, how well they've worked, how they could be strengthened further. The great positive of the SAGE model is that it's not a sort of standing fixed committee other than its chair, the chief scientist, but it wrote, you bring in relevant experts to address a given question at speed, obviously, because the nature of an emergency is, you're having to respond very quickly. So that, I think, is a strength. The downside, though, of that very flexibility in a situation like this is that you essentially assemble a group of people who haven't been through any of the normal processes of appointment to a public body. There's been no real scrutiny of questions of balance or background, essentially, what happens in that crisis, the chief scientist starts sort of ringing up and email, you gradually assemble, well, not gradually, you very quickly assemble who you think are the best people to do the job. And I think what happened in the UK was the approach that was taken, I guess, quite understandably in the early stages. And then as it went on a couple of months, more and more questions were being asked about that body, who was on it, who wasn't on it, what mix of scientific or disciplinary expertise was included, what mix of more practice-based expertise was there or not there in terms of public health experts, etc. And there was this great big pressure to make the thing more open, which a bit slowly, in my view, but the system did respond, and they have made SAGE much more open, and they do now publish, not instantly, but they do publish the minutes of meetings, and there's generally a lot more awareness of who's involved. They have also opened up and broadened the range of experts that are on the SAGE group. So so it's been interesting to watch, and I think they like we all have been slightly learning on the job and improvising in the face of something of this magnitude. But I don't think the SAGE model is perfect for something like this. And I think we will have to have, as a country, as I'm sure every country on the earth will be having, a sort of serious think coming out of this as to what structures are optimal. I think the downside of very fluid structures is that when you then try and identify a line of accountability, I mean, going back to Heather's model, if you don't even know who's on the group, how does one develop proper lines of accountability, obligation, etc.? It becomes very sort of elusive almost when you're trying to put some accountability in place.
Thank you, and I really like the fact that you raised the three kind of chaos control scenarios there, but just looking more broadly, and we've got some questions from the audience. China, Japan, APAC countries, even Australia, how well they've done with this, and they haven't maybe got the same strength of scientific institutions that we have in the US or the UK. And it's like, it's quite a shock for the public to kind of see this, that, we've done so badly in all of this, and depending on if your metric is number of hospitalizations and deaths. So, I mean, what can we learn from, countries, APAC countries, China on this? Is it because of the experience of, MERS and SARS and all that, back in the day? Yeah, love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to unpack there, Elizabeth. I mean, I think definitely the if we were to compare, say, the UK to China, having had SARS and the response to that fixed, as a reference point in the Chinese system, meant that they went into the pandemic obviously with a very different set of assumptions to the British model, which was much more grounded in expectations of an influenza pandemic. And I mean, that was very clear at the outset, and that was one of the mistakes, I guess, that was made here. I think obviously another interesting dynamic to reflect upon is that countries like Britain, indeed many European countries, and of course the US as well, felt that it would be democratically, politically, socially impossible to impose the kinds of restrictions on freedoms that are more readily imposed, of course, in more authoritarian political systems, but quite alien to ours. And of course, ultimately those restrictions were imposed in most countries, at least in Europe. And I guess one of the most surprising things was the extent to which they were accepted and complied with. I think, so I think there were also errors there in terms of the assumptions, we hadn't done, countries like the UK, I don't think had done enough preparatory work on the social science side of all of this. We had lots of fantastic virologists, epidemiologists, in place to respond. But when it came to the sort of social response to a pandemic and what people were prepared to do and accept, I think we were flying blind, as many countries were in the early stages. So yeah, there's no end of things. I mean, I think it's more complicated than simply this worked there and therefore why didn't country B do what country A did? Because this is one of the great insights you get from studying science policy systems, and particularly sort of from a science studies type perspective, that you can't really separate out the science advice bit from the broader political and decision making culture in a society. Sheila Jasnoff, who I mentioned earlier, talks about this in terms of civic epistemologies of different countries, and I think that's really where one needs to start in comparing. Otherwise you sort of end up saying, oh, didn't New Zealand do well, and shouldn't we all be like, which is a slightly facile entry point to what's actually a very complicated debate.
And one very quick question for you, because we need to move on to our next speaker, but going back to this idea of scientific advisor being an independent concept, although now it's being challenged. We've seen a lot of these joint press conferences where we have scientists alongside the politicians. Do you think they work, or do you think we need to have more press conferences where it's mainly the scientists? Just like to hear your thoughts on that very briefly.
Yes, I mean, I think, again, to talk about the UK, because we've had a lot of these. I think when they first began, a lot of people in the scientific community were very pleased to see the scientists sort of front and not centre, because the Prime Minister would be in the centre, but front and either side, with the Prime Minister in the centre, as a visible demonstration of the emphasis that the government was placing on inputs from its science advisors, and of course that's carried. So I mean, symbolically, performatively, I think it had a value. Particularly in the early stages. I can see why they sort of staged it in that way, and one almost needs to think about the sort of dramaturgy of the whole thing. I mean, creating that setting and the three podiums, and in the way that we had all the time from Number 10, as a very deliberate choice. I was, and I think others in science, these sorts of fields were also quite queasy about it when we saw it at the start, because I think you could see it storing up the kinds of problems that then did arise later on, when the messiness, as Heather put it, the sort of blurriness between advice and decision making, and was made more complicated still by the sort of co-presence of both the advice and the decision maker, the advisor and the decision maker, you know, on the same platform, kind of backing each other up. So I do think there is a case for some functional and symbolic separation, even though of course you do want the things to be joined up, you know, in terms of how they're working together in a crisis. But I mean, I go back again, I think it's very easy to sort of, you know, take cheap shots at what's gone on. I mean, my overwhelming, and I mean, there are things I would criticise our science advisors for over the course of the past 12. I'm sure there are things that they themselves would do differently if they had the gift of hindsight. But I think overwhelmingly, one comes out of this year with a huge sense of debt, really, and gratitude to people like Patrick Vallance, Chris Whitty for the role that they performed. I mean, they must have had a just impossibly difficult job to do in these circumstances. And I mean, which of us would want to be in their shoes, I think.
Thank you, James. That's marvellous. And we'll come back to you, James, later on when we have the panel discussion at the end. So now we need to move on to our next presenter, and I'm very pleased to introduce Clarissa Rios. She's the research associate, research associate at the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk, which I love that title, marvellous place, must be marvellous place to work, at the University of Cambridge. It's all over to you, Clarissa. Thank you.
Thank you so much. If I could have the slides, please. Well, I can start saying that at the Center for the Study of Existential Risk, we are dedicated to the study and mitigation of risks that could lead to human extinction or civilization collapse. And I guess that you may be wondering, where are the slides? But you will also maybe wondering which type of events are the ones that can bring humanity to this type of civilization collapse or human extinction. So if we go to the third slide, you can see more or less some images that can lead you to think what I'm talking about. So such events are, for example, the misuse or unintended consequences of artificial intelligence, bioweapons, including human-engineered pandemics, for example, nuclear war, highly disruptive volcanic eruptions, extreme climate change, ecological collapse, and even asteroid impact. And of course, this is a lot of research that is being produced in our center, and you may be wondering, how do you go from here to something more applied and start doing science advice? Next slide, please. And at CSER, what we are trying to do is to focus our work in our policy engagements with 3 different stakeholders that may be different, but they are equally important for us. So we work with civil society that goes from advising NGOs to political parties, professional associations, even universities, also to the public sector, which will be any institution that belongs to the government at different local, national, and international levels, and also with the industry. So we will be dealing with from startups to businesses in biotechnology, agriculture, and even in IT. Next slide, please. So what I thought to do this time, because I saw the presentations of my colleagues, was to focus a little bit about examples, some examples, because I know that some of you may be interested on how to start or what can you do to start learning more about how to do successful and impactful policy engagements. So something that has happened to me since the last year that I started is that I have done some sort of policy engagements through different pathways. And that's something that I have realized that that's how it happens. It's not a protocol that you follow. You just have to find like all the different paths that will lead you to a successful policy engagement. In this case, in this slide, I would like to talk about how to do it through science brokers. And by science brokers, I mean by an institution that can be the bridge between you, the academia, and policymakers. For example, in March of last year, the Science and Technology Office of the Parliament in the UK launched an COVID-19 outbreak expert database. and they invited anyone who wanted to support the UK Parliament in its work and had expertise in COVID-19 to register. After that, they sent us an online survey to all the experts. We were around 1,100, and with the results from that survey, this office could produce 15 reports that were talking about the short, medium, and long-term concerns of experts that have in different areas that went from vaccine development to education, health, etc. Other science broker that I have been working on is Alpenglow, which is formed by ex-civil servants, and now they are trying to put long-term thinking at the head of policymaking. And we have been helping them in different type of white papers, or sometimes they have requests from the cabinet office that they want to know a little bit more about, for example, safety on artificial intelligence. So CSER experts are sent there to inform there and give short advice about that. Next slide, please. Other type of engagements are as something that I call through direct initiatives. So in this case, I will be talking about, for example, when CSER is contacted directly and invited to present evidence to the UK Parliament. In this case, Catherine Rhodes, which is the director of the center, was invited to talk about biorisk and bioweapons and advise the House of Lords. And on the picture on the right, you can see a submission that I did with some colleagues. And it was an open call, because maybe you have this type of mechanisms in your country, but in the UK, they have these open calls for evidence. So in this case, the House of Lords is going to write a report by November, if I'm not mistaken, and they want to know more about emerging risks and how the UK can deal with them in a better way. So we decided to focus on foresight methods. We wrote 6 pages, very short, talking about what are the methods that we have in-house and how we have used them in the past, giving examples of how they can be applied at the House of Lords. Next slide, please. Another initiative that I have been working recently is with the All-Party Parliamentarian Group for Future Generations at the UK Parliament. And right now we are having, today I have my 5th meeting with them, because we are helping them to redraft a bill for future generations, the well-being of future generations. And this is something, a really nice story, because CSER, the place where I work, has been the main promoter of the future generations idea in the UK, because, or in England, because everything started with Natalie Jones, which is a colleague of mine, that wrote a paper about why we should think about coming up with an all-parliamentarian group about that, and then that the creation of a bill can happen, and this happened some years ago, and now we can see that it finally happened. And we are supporting this this initiative. Next slide, please. And talking a little bit more about what you can do outside your own country, I wanted to bring 2 examples on this slide. I was involved with the G20, more specifically with the Science 20 team, which is a group that is in charge to gather the whole global scientific community through the national academies and advise the G20 leaders. So we did that, we got together, we had also some surveys, some meetings, even webinars together, and the outcome of those conversations are the report that you can see on the left, Foresight, Science for Navigating Critical Transitions, that I invite everyone to take a look. There is a lot of examples of how foresight is being used in different parts of the world, and why is it important that we think about how to implement this in science advice. On the right side, I will talk a little bit about my involvement with the World Economic Forum. I'm part of the Global Future Council on Frontier Risks. And one of our first jobs, let's say, was to support the Global Risk Report, which is an annual study published by the World Economic Forum ahead of the forum's annual meeting in Davos in Switzerland, and is based on the work of the Global Risk Network. And the report describes changes occurring in the global risk landscape from year to year. And what we did was to add a little bit of our expert collective intelligence with the group, let's say. And what we did was to prepare a list of future scenarios. For example, we described very short future worlds where genome editing has overpower us, or where the melting of the permafrost has released new viruses, and we are having like a new COVID-19 with viruses that we have never seen before, for example. And the idea to do this was to encourage more expansive thinking about the universe of risk possibilities in the next decade. And of course, we want to do it, what we really want to do is to enable preparation rather than paralysis, as well as resilience in the frontiers of risks. Right now, with the Global Future Council, we're working on a white paper about risk pathologies and potential pathways for redress. And you may know that WEF is really good at multi-stakeholder efforts. And I joined this Future Council because I think that what we need is not just academia and governments, but we also need the industry. And all together with citizens, we probably can find more innovative solutions. Next slide, please. Yes, another way that you can also be involved in science advice and contribute in that sense is joining different committees. And in this case, I'm, for example, engaged with the International Science Council and the United Nations Disaster Risk Reduction as an expert reviewer. And what we are doing right now is to have a group of meetings where we talk about redrafting, again, a new research agenda for the Sendai framework. So the Sendai framework is an agreement signed by many countries about global risk, and the research agenda is the one that is sort of like the guide of this framework. Next slide, please. Yes, and well, with this slide, I want to mention that because my background is on molecular biology, I'm very familiarized with, let's say, bioweapons, and that's why I'm very connected with the United Nations Biological Weapon Convention, and I have been helping them, for example, training young scientists from the Global South to learn more about science diplomacy, about science advice. But in this case, in the figure on the picture on the left is a presentation that I made for the meeting of experts when all the countries get together, and I just I propose some initiatives on how they can strengthen their work at the BWC. On the picture on the right, it was a presentation I had some months ago at the Mexican Parliament, because they are trying to understand more, for example, how is the science advice happening in the UK, because they are trying to also implement their own in there, and they invite us to talk a little bit about that. Next slide. Okay, so this part is just for you to think a little bit about what can you do at your institution. So, for example, at my institution, I decided that we should improve our knowledge management, because around, let's say, 40% of our experts engage in policy, but the other 60 not. So maybe there is a lack of sharing of knowledge or understanding what science advice is or science diplomacy is. So what I did was to conduct a series of interviews and surveys and wrote a report. And right now you are just seeing the raw data because it's with a designer, but I will hopefully soon be sharing the nice report. And what I did was to collect the best study cases that CSER, where I work, has in terms of impactful science advice. And we have like 7 examples, and I have divided into what was the process, step by step, like a guide on what things that you can do, and what are the skills and methods that can help you to have a very successful one. Another thing that I did was to, with my colleague, was to map the different organizations that we have been having engagements within UK, governments outside the UK, civil society, industry, etc. Next slide. Yeah, something that I also find that is very important is to understand what are the outputs, what can your scientific academic knowledge can contribute to. So I also collected all these outcomes, and for example, one of them is contribute to the European Commission's white paper on artificial intelligence, help a startup to define what are going to be their ethical values, report on recommendations for the UN high-level panel on digital comparison. So this, I think, it makes you to bring down to earth about how your science advice can really contribute to the real world. And something that we also did was to create a scorecard trying to make researchers at our center to think about the co-creation, co-production, and co-delivery of knowledge. So at different stage of their research, we are giving them different statements to think about that may in the future help them to develop more impactful policy engagements. Next slide, please. Finally, I just want to mention that in this report, one of the things that we also included was a clear definition of what policy impact is and what's the difference with research impact. What are the different stakeholders that we work with? What are the hot topics, let's say, like the topics in demand in our own field of study, which is global catastrophic and existential risk? How to get started, some ideas of how our colleagues got started on this. Some of them was because they did an expert elicitation and then they were later invited to that. The other ones were continually looking for this opportunity, so we write all that. What are the skills that you need for doing this type of work? What are the don'ts, that you don't have to do during these policy engagements? And we also want to be transparent. There are good and bad when you embark in these kind of things. So we also have a list of the benefits, but also disadvantage of engaging in policy. Next slide, please. And we finally end up the report by just thinking, what can we do better as an institution? And if we want to have more, that our research is not just left out in the academic world where maybe 10 people is going to read it, but we want more policymakers, more citizens, more CEOs reading about our work and thinking, how can I apply this to my own institutions? So one of the recommendations that we have in the report are to come up with a strategic annual plan for policy work, when to do it, how to do it, and why. And we also think that we could come up with more workshops, knowledge sharing, journal clubs, and then to come up to bring up more study cases. And one study case that has recently was brought to my attention was, maybe you have heard about the report from Partha Dasgupta on the economics of biodiversity. So in this case, the UK Cabinet Office requests this academic to come up with this report, and it was launched having Boris Johnson, having the Prince Charles talking about it, and it's going to be used on changing their policies. So I thought that's a fantastic study case to learn how it started, what are the don'ts, what are the tips and recommendations that we can have. Another thing that you can do to improve your policy engagements at your institution could be to create a policy board. In the same way that you have like an academic board to help you, to guide you, maybe a policy board can support you and motivate you to have more policy engagements. And we also realize that we have to have a better monitoring. Sometimes we are asked to give science advice, but then it takes 6 months until we see an outcome, and sometimes we forget or we don't follow because we have so many policy engagements. So my last thing will be just to bring your attention to this figure on the right. This is a comic that we did because we are also constantly thinking, what can we do to improve our policy engagement? How can we reach more people in a faster and more efficient way that captures their attention and trigger emotions, which is the most important thing when you want someone to really pay attention. And this is based on a scientific article about bioengineering and foresight that we did. And it talks about future scenarios and how the world could look. So that was like a good hook for many people to be interested on the paper. So I guess that my next slide is just to say thank you so much. And if you have any questions, you can reach us through Caesar, or you can reach directly to me, and I'll be more than happy to connect with you. Thanks.
Thank you, Clarissa. Amazing presentation there. And I'm surprised you can get your day job done with all the advice you're giving. But one question for you before we actually open the discussion to the panel. So your department has advised many stakeholders from, NGOs, civil society, governments. I just want to kind of explore, have you seen differences among stakeholders in how that advice is actually understood? Are there any lessons for us? I mean, are there some better understanding it than others? It'd be just really interesting to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think that, well, in terms of time, perhaps the ones that have less time to talk to you are the ones that coming from the government. Maybe you are happy if you have 15 minutes to talk about 3 publications in a very concise way. But with the other stakeholders is, I think, is much easier. There is much more time and space for you to come up with ideas and to talk and to have brainstorming together. In that sense, yeah, I think time is the most important thing, I think, for policymakers. So I will bring that up.
Thank you, Clarissa. And because we're running a little bit short on time, I'm going to now open the floor and welcome back all our panelists. If they can turn on their videos, and then we're going to have an open discussion. There's a lot of questions coming through, but let me just start with one myself just to begin the discussion. And this is trying to unpack communication around scientific advice. And I'd love to get your thoughts on how can this be improved to build trust with the public without causing panic and reflecting uncertainty. Maybe your top thoughts on that. Maybe we'll start with Heather and then we'll go around. Thank you, Heather.
So just how should science advisors think about their job as communicators? Yeah, so I think it's really important that science advisors attempt to be clear about what the basis for what they're saying. So, and this requires some thought about the crafting of words and the framing of problems that goes into that. Like, what really needs to be conveyed? I was stunned to watch the uptake of the idea of flattening the curve last spring. I mean, flattening the curve is a super technical idea in epidemiology that I had never heard of, that most people, I think, had not thought about. And within a month, it was both a mantra that could be used by public health officials to motivate behavior and was understood to be sort of a crucial component of the crisis. And people didn't misunderstand it. They understood it was like greatly reducing the number of deaths by attempting to flatten the curve and reducing burdens on hospitals. So there's an example where communication is both sort of proactive, like here's something we can do to make things better. Yes, people are going to die, but it's going to be less if we can flatten the curve. Here's the thing you need to do in order to flatten the curve, and here's the impact of flattening the curve as best we can understand. So that kind of layering and utilization of a clear idea is so important.
Fabulous. And James?
Yes, I mean, I agree. I mean, I think, in terms of the sort of skills and the roles here, I mean, obviously we ideally, we want to, any scientist, any researcher could at some point find themselves moving into an advisory capacity, in their own field or in an adjacent field. And you want to encourage and support and put structures in place to enable more of that kind of movement and fluidity between different settings. At the same time, I think we shouldn't underestimate the additional skills and training that's often required for scientists, experts of any hue, to operate effectively in that political environment. And I mean, again, one could point, because I point to a number of examples in different countries where problems have arisen. I think partly because of naivety sounds patronizing, but I mean a certain sort of lack of appreciation of the texture of how talking in terms that would be perfectly normal and acceptable in a academic seminar can actually be quite problematic in a public context during a pandemic or whatever. So I think that these are the skills of synthesis, of translation, of brokerage. I mean, all these terms that we use to describe what effective advisors do, and we need to take seriously the task of building and training those capacities in the system, so that whether it's an emergency or something more routine, we've got people who obviously are deeply grounded in their own expertise in their given field, but also have acquired these translational skills. And I think a good corollary is science communication. Obviously we want all scientists to communicate, that would be great. In reality, we know some scientists are better at communicating than others. Some scientists understand how to communicate better than others in a media sense. I think the same is true of advice.
And Clarissa, do you have anything to add to that?
Yes, I think that the power of a good story is always a good tool. sometimes you can show the data and the statistics, but you share a story of someone in the hospital during the COVID-19, and I think that will trigger more emotions and make the people think and take your next words more into account. Also, there has been a rising of science communicators, and I've seen it during the last year, and I'm really glad to see how many scientists are taking their time to explain, as you mentioned at the very beginning, like RNA, what is it, what are these type of vaccines. And this maybe sounds a little bit extreme, but I think that now that we have the opportunity to do sometimes workshops for government officials, we have to think about innovative ways how to do it. And one thing that comes to my mind is that in US, when they were trying to show what was happening with the smuggling of people coming from the south to the borders, instead of having a presentation, what they did was to bring them to those places and make them go through one of the tunnels. And I think that making people to be closer to those situations that they are not used to can also trigger this type of emotions that can lead to action.
And Clarissa, we've got a good question from the audience, and I'd like to put it to you because you've advised so many governments. So even with the best scientific advice, you know, if it's clear and well positioned, governments or politicians can choose to ignore it. I'm just wondering, in your own experience, have you seen that, and what are the tools at your disposal to deal with that?
Well, let's be honest, and I think that this is one of the issues that we have with the experts in our team, because some of them don't know what's the final outcome, what happens if their advice was included at least until the last moment when the report is launched and you can see that your name has been acknowledged or that phrase that you contributed is there. So I think that's still one of the problems that we have in order for monitoring and think about how much impact you have generated. But yeah, but you also have to think that not all your policy engagement have to end up on the creation of a new bill, right? Like happened with the example that I made. Even that the simple thing to know that you learn how to communicate better, you learn how the politics work, how the policy cycle it's formed, and in which part you can interview, you can advise better. I think that's already like a big, high five to yourself. You are doing it, and next time you're a little bit closer to know how to do it. And of course, having platforms like this to you share your knowledge, and you have more senior than me, like James and Heather, to teach us how they have been doing it for all these years, I think it's perfect. Knowledge sharing.
Thank you for that. And Heather, kind of another question that's come through the chat. Let's look at conflicts of interest. Some of these science advisors within government, they're paid, they're paid by the government. So how can we trust the advice they give? I mean, how can we make it even more independent? What are your thoughts on that? Thank you.
Okay, so I don't think we should be trying to make it independent in the sense I talked about. This is why I think it's really important that science advice, if at all possible, be made public. Both so the scientific community can critique it for its accuracy, so that the science advisors don't end up just pandering to their paymasters, right? This is really important, but also so the public is made aware of what the science advisors are saying and can evaluate the responses of the politicians appropriately and see whether or not the scientific community is in fact critiquing what the science advisors are saying. So all of this has to be sort of in the public sphere as much as possible, because we live in a democracy, and we, it's the prerogative of the democratically elected officials to ignore advice, but it's not the prerogative of science advisors to just tell the politicians what they want to hear. Right. So this is why all the lines of obligation have to be in operation all the time. So, even if I get paid by someone, it doesn't mean that it is my job to just tell them what they want to hear.
Great. And a few questions coming up, and I'm going to put this to James, about kind of the role of data, and when you have incomplete data and modeling in scientific advice, especially in the early days of the pandemic, creating these models on very little data as to what actually was happening with the disease. Do you want to talk to us a little bit about that, the uncertainty, and how we can deal with that?
Yeah, I think modelling is obviously a great example of a domain where it's very important that the scientists involved in generating and presenting and at times advocating for the strengths of their model in a policy decision context, or a public context indeed, that they are being completely I mean, as Heather said, open and transparent as to the degrees and boundaries of uncertainty that are attached. And I mean, this is an area where I think there's a huge amount that we can learn from the climate sphere, where, you know, this heated politics of climate modelling has been at the absolute heart of both scientific debate, but also of the wider societal debate around climate change, and, you know, reports from the IPCC, etc., over you know, the past 25 years, and particularly over the past, you know, 10, 15. So that, you know, there is a lot of experience of even those precise debates about modelling in other spheres. And going back to my earlier point about sort of learning and building capacity, I mean, I think, you know, an emergency erupts like COVID, of course, you know, you've not got time to run, you know, 3-month training courses for people or whatever. You've just got to respond. But I do also feel at times in the heat of it all, we've forgotten more than we've learned. You know, we've kind of unlearned things that we've spent the past 25 years painfully often, you know, accumulating knowledge and experience of, and you know, and I mean, I understand why that's happened, but it's a bit depressing, I guess one would say, insofar as we have actually, I would say we, you know, the research system, the political system in many countries have thought about these things quite deeply in other contexts, and we need to get better at having those mechanisms ready, not only to deal with the emergency, but also to bring relevant lessons from before. Final point, I mean, we used to have, we still do in a modest way, have in the UK science advice system something called the Foresight Program, which was set up, and it's a bit of a diminished version of what it was in its heyday. But this is a function that, as the name suggests, sort of does horizon scanning and spots the next big thing that's coming, or several big things. And it you know, produced some very important reports over the years for the UK government, including, I should say, on you know, pandemics and the kind of existential crises that Clarissa's centre is focused upon. But I think, you know, as well as foresight, you need hindsight. You know, it would be great to see a government put in place an office of hindsight that was just packed with really, really smart historians and political scientists and scientists themselves who've got sort of war experience, if you like, battle experience, who could bring that learning to bear in the heat of the moment. And I think, you know, we are very bad in government, we're bad in British government, we're bad in other governments, at retaining institutional memory and capacity. It's a real problem. I'm you know, 47, and when I'm in a science policy meeting in the British government in Bays, I'm often, you know, the only person in the room will have a memory of a policy debate, you know, 15 years ago, because people move around the whole time in British civil service. So that's a big challenge.
Thank you for that, James. And back to you, Heather. Now, question from me, really. Do you think ministers, policymakers, ask the right scientific questions?
Well, sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't, right? So, you know, I don't think that we have to place the burden on politicians to ask the right science policy questions. I think, you know, when they don't ask a right question, they have something like really framed. Maybe they think a perpetual motion machine is possible. I don't know, like something that is utterly implausible, or they want something that cannot be done. Or they want something that's really going to be very expensive in other ways, like it's going to cost a lot of human lives. We had a president who just didn't want to have to wear a mask. And so, you know, then the job of the advisor is to say, not, you know, suppose the politician asks, like, how do we end mask wearing as soon as possible? And, you know, the job of the advisor at that point in time is not to say, oh, well, you know, you could just say stop wearing masks, but it's going to cost you so many thousands of lives to do that. Are you sure you want that? So there's very often a need to reframe or shift questions by an understanding of what is at a concern of the politician. Politicians are the ones who are supposed to be elected to represent public interest. So in order to, the advisor has to connect in a certain way with the public interest that is trying to be represented by the politician. That's sort of the democratic conundrum, and why the job of the science advisor is so complicated. Does that help?
Yes, it does. Thank you so much for that. And another question from the audience, and I think I'll put this to you, Carissa. It's kind of more, how do you track how scientific advice is used, including the good and bad examples? So that would be really good to hear from you on that.
Yeah, I think that the idea of the report could be something that the person that asked this question could do, because it's the best way to really monitor what is happening. Because before the report, we have like an Excel table where we put which is the engagement, when it happened, what was about, what was the final outcome. But if you really want to learn how to improve, I think is that you have to conduct this series of interviews and also distinguish which type of organizations are the best ones that are going to give you more impact, let's say, for the purpose that you have in your mind, and also what is the shorter and more effective pathway. And for that, you need to talk with different people that has been doing similar things. And then that's why I also say that you should have an annual strategic plan. In that case, you can, if you already map the organizations that you're interested on, you can say, instead of focusing on 20, we're going to focusing on 5. We're going to learn about the mechanisms, the limitations, and then we're going to think and plan our policy engagement.
Fantastic. And I'd just like to ask the panel a more general question. Let's explore the role of scientific institutes like the World Health Organization. So investigation into the origin of COVID in China kind of hit a wall, and the WHO has kind of somewhat been, damaged, maybe misled. So what next for the World Health Organization and other public health agencies, maybe like the CDC, that were perhaps sidelined during the Trump years? Maybe we'll start with you, Heather, on that. Thank you.
Well, I know that scientists in the US federal government are very excited to be back with a president who actually is interested in hearing advice and maybe capable of hearing advice. It was never entirely clear that Trump could even hear the advice that was being given, which was super hard to watch as an American. I think in general, I kind of want to talk about the issue of what next. I mean, James asked this sort of really interesting question of, what should we be doing post-pandemic? What should we be thinking about? There's been all this talk of this moment of openness and transformation and possibility, but we haven't seen those transformations yet. And I think one of the issues sort of in front of people thinking about science advice is, should we be thinking about institutional reform? Are there rules? Are there structures that we need to shift? Or is it a matter of cultural reform? That sort of the soft practices, the expectations, the norms that sort of govern practices, is that what needs to shift? And where are we sort of most likely to see a benefit of putting effort into shifting either institutional reforms or cultural reforms, or maybe both in tandem? And I think that sort of level of analysis is going to be really crucial going forward and going to be very specific to the particular organization you're talking about. That's a nice way of dodging the particularities.
No, it's fine. You can dodge. James, are you going to dodge, or are you going to try and answer that one? What is the future of these multilateral scientific institutes? Love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert on the sort of machinations of the WHO, so I might duck that one. But I mean, obviously, as numerous people have said, coming out of this pandemic, the case for strengthening global health coordination and coordination in respect to pandemics is made with ever greater force. And I do quite a lot of work with the Wellcome Trust in the UK, and I mean, they are one of the big players in the funding system who have for many years been making this argument and have been putting money into initiatives like Gavi and related efforts on the vaccine side. So I think that I mean, if we come out of this and there isn't a serious attempt to reappraise and look afresh at the global architecture of governance of health, then we really are in trouble. And of course, shifts in the US make that easier than would have been the case. So I mean, I think more broadly, multilateral institutions. Yes, I mean, it's I mean, I think it's actually been very interesting through the pandemic, you know, having said all of that about the importance of WHO and everything else. I mean, it's also been a very striking feature of responses that much has been centered at the national level. And in a sense, a lot of countries have sort of felt the need to go through the process of their own appraisal and assessment of how to respond and in what way, etc. And I think you know, that reminds us of the need. I think it partly goes back to some of Heather's points about the lines of accountability that need to exist within a system. That if science advice becomes this sort of thing that's happening up here in some stratospheric global level and doesn't have lines back down into ordinary structures of national, local, regional governance, then it will run into problems as well. So clearly we need to be thinking about this in a sort of multi-level way. INCSA, if I could give a very brief plug for something, you know, I mean, the International Network for Government Science Advice was basically set up by Peter Gluckman and you know, a few other serving science advisors to try and really tackle this problem and to try and build those connections and build those capacities. So there's lots of reflection on this on the INCSA site, and again I point to Wellcome and particularly Jeremy Farrar, who I think is a really wise voice on all these questions around global health governance at the moment.
Great, and we only really have a few minutes left now, so I'm just going to put my last question to Clarissa, and this is looking a bit of future gazing, Clarissa. So in terms of the future, let's forget about COVID for the time being. Which areas of science advice are going to be really, really sought? Is it AI? Is it cybersecurity? Ocean health? Let's. I'd love to hear your thoughts in 2 minutes if you can, because we're going to be ending soon.
Definitely, I think the role of artificial intelligence, machine learning, and how aligned to human values is or not is going to be a big thing. And then the second thing, of course, I will say synthetic biology and genome editing on embryos and enhancement. And maybe the third thing could be what everyone is saying about the unknown unknowns, right? Like technology is going so fast, and we were probably going to have to be worrying about new things soon.
Thank you so much for that. That is amazing. Thank you for the presentations. That was really amazing. Thank you to our audience for asking all those brilliant questions. And I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to answer all your questions, but we have 2 more sessions coming up on the 18th of March and the 25th of March. So please do join and, you know, ask more questions. This is not a topic that's going away. I suppose, you know, my one takeaway from this is that science advice is one input only, and end of the day, you know, the policymaker or whoever the advisee is going to have to pull all together all the information they have to make a judgment end of the day. You know, it's a judgment. It's not easy, but take the public with you, hold their hand, be transparent. And we know politics and science will not always get along, but let's try and get it along together. So look, thank you so much, everyone. I really appreciated all your time today. Thank you.